So 80%. I mean, when you really sit down and look at the entire scope of aviation history, right, all the catastrophic failures, the close calls, those multi-million-dollar smoking craters, 80% of the time, the root cause isn't actually a snapped rotor blade.
Right.
It isn't, a sudden microburst of wind, and it definitely isn't a dead battery. The root cause in literally 8 out of 10 aviation accidents is just the human being holding the controls.
Yeah, it really is a staggering reality check, especially when you consider just the sheer volume of technology we've poured into modern aircraft over the years.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we have carbon fiber airframes, triple redundant GPS systems, and these flight controllers doing, thousands of calculations a second just to keep a drone perfectly level in a gale.
Yeah.
And yet the weakest link in that entire chain remains the squishy, flawed, highly distractible human brain that's actually operating the system.
Yeah, that statistic is exactly how we're kicking things off today.
Yeah.
Because we have a pretty massive undertaking on the table for this deep dive.
We really do.
We are looking at a high-level, comprehensive overview of the entire FAA remote pilot syllabus. And the official stack of sources is sitting right here in front of me.
It's a heavy stack, too.
It is. We've got the FAA Remote Pilot Small Unmanned Aircraft System Study Guide, that's publication FAA-G-8082-22, and the Airman Knowledge Testing Supplement, which is FAA-CT-8082H.
Right.
So if you are out there preparing for your Part 107 exam, or honestly, if you just want to understand the invisible architecture of the sky above you, probably have these books, and they are incredibly dense.
Oh, they can totally feel like reading a dictionary. I mean, you have a chapter on reading a weather report, and then that's immediately followed by a chapter on calculating center of gravity, which is followed by a chapter on airspace dimensions.
Right. It's just all over the place.
Exactly. And if you just try to rote memorize them, it feels like this scattered collection of random trivia.
Which is exactly why we are tossing out the flashcard approach completely today. We are going to look at this entire mountain of information through one very specific, incredibly important lens. And that lens is Aeronautical Decision-Making, or ADM.
Yes, ADM is everything.
Because here is the real secret to the syllabus. Every single technical rule, every chart, every strange weather code you have to learn is actually just a tool. It exists solely to feed data into your brain so you can make a safe decision.
That's spot on.
So by the end of this deep dive, you'll see how all these seemingly disconnected chapters are actually part of one cohesive machine.
Yeah, and Chapter 10 of the study guide dives directly into this whole concept of ADM. To really understand why the FAA pushes it so hard, you kind of have to look back at how the aviation industry used to operate.
Oh, yeah. The Wild West days.
Seriously.
Yeah.
For a long time, the prevailing wisdom was that good judgment was just, well, a natural byproduct of logging hours. The thought was basically, if you survived flying for 10 years, you automatically had good judgment.
Trial by not crashing.
Exactly. A very dangerous trial, because as pilots continued to log thousands of accident-free hours, they were still making massive, catastrophic errors in judgment.
Wow.
Yeah, the experience wasn't inoculating them against cognitive bias or fatigue or stress, so the commercial airline industry developed something called crew resource management, or CRM, which is detailed in Chapter 6.
Okay, right. I've actually read about this in the context of those major airline disasters in the 70s.
Yeah, those were a major catalyst.
Like the captain would make a mistake and the co-pilot was just too intimidated to speak up. So CRM was really about breaking down that dictatorship in the cockpit, right?
That is exactly it. It taught flight crews to effectively use all available resources. So the human resources, the hardware, the external information to actually facilitate crew cooperation.
Makes sense.
The captain was trained to actively solicit input, and the crew was trained to assertively communicate hazards. And the FAA produced specific training directed at improving this decision-making process. The results were just undeniable.
How good were they?
Well, in the operational environment, one operator flying about 400,000 hours annually demonstrated a 54% reduction in accident rates after implementing these ADM materials.
Wait, a 54% reduction?
Yep.
You literally cut the accident rate in half just by teaching people how to process information as a team. That's incredible. But here is the obvious disconnect for anyone listening who's flying a small drone.
Right, the lack of a crew.
Exactly. Most of the time, you aren't flying with a co-pilot, a navigator, and a flight engineer. It is just you, a remote controller, and maybe a client tapping their watch, wondering when you're going to get the real estate shot.
Right, and that reality forced CRM to evolve into SRM, which stands for Single Pilot Resource Management.
Okay.
SRM is basically the art and science of managing all the resources available to a single pilot prior to and during flight to ensure the successful outcome of the flight.
But how do you do that without a crew to bounce ideas off of?
Well, the FAA provides mental frameworks for that. The foundational one in Chapter 10 is the 3P model: perceive, process, perform.
Okay, let's walk through that because, frameworks only work if you actually know how to apply them in real life.
Sure. So it's designed as a continuous loop. First, you perceive the given set of circumstances for a flight, like what are the hazards right now. Then you process that information by evaluating the impact of those hazards on flight safety.
Right.
And finally, you perform by implementing the best course of action. And then the loop just starts all over again.
It sounds good in theory, but perceiving hazards is a pretty wide net.
It is.
If you've never encountered a specific hazard, you might look at a cloudy sky and a line of trees and think everything is totally fine. How do you actively perceive something you don't even know to look for?
That's a great point. And the study guide provides a sub-framework specifically to help you perceive hazards. It's the PAVE checklist, outlined in Figure 10.3.4, PAVE. It breaks the world down into 4 specific categories: pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures.
Okay, let's focus heavily on the P to start. The pilot. Because this ties directly into Chapter 9, which covers physiological factors.
Yep, the human element.
And I want to try an analogy here to see if this captures how the FAA views that human element. Think of aeronautical decision-making as the operating system of a smartphone, right?
Yeah.
Like iOS or Android.
Okay, I like where this is going.
All the technical rules you have to learn for the test, the weather apps, the airspace maps, the loading charts, those are just individual applications installed on the phone.
That tracks perfectly with how SRM works, actually.
Right, so if the operating system itself is lagging or infected with a virus, or the battery is at like 1%, it absolutely does not matter how perfectly you memorize the airspace rules. The operating system is going to crash, the apps will fail to launch, and you're going to put the drone right into a tree.
Exactly. And that is exactly why the rules in 14 CFR Part 107 regarding pilot impairment are so incredibly unforgiving.
They really are.
The FAA knows that if the operating system is compromised, the entire flight is a hazard. You simply cannot operate a drone if you are impaired. And we often jump straight to alcohol or illegal drugs, but physiological impairment is actually much broader than that.
Yeah, the Chapter 9 specifically mentions over-the-counter medications, which I think catches a lot of people off guard.
Oh, absolutely. Certain antihistamines, decongestants, or even just basic cough syrups can severely compromise your ADM. They cause drowsiness, they slow your visual tracking, and they delay your reaction times.
Wow.
Yeah, Part 107 strictly prohibits you from serving as a remote pilot in command or even just acting as a visual observer if you've taken anything that affects your faculties in any way contrary to safety.
It makes total sense when you look at the time frames of decision-making. The text actually highlights a chart, Figure 10-3, breaking down risk management into time frames.
Yeah.
Strategic, deliberate, and time-critical. If you are sitting at your desk planning a flight for next Tuesday, you have the luxury of deliberate decision-making. You can take your time. But when the drone is in the air, you are almost exclusively operating in the time-critical time frame.
And time-critical decision-making relies heavily on what the book calls naturalized or automatic decision-making. You just don't have 3 minutes to draw out the 3P model on a whiteboard when a helicopter suddenly crests a hill right in front of you.
No, definitely not.
You have to react instantly based on training and reflex. If your central nervous system is depressed by a basic allergy pill, that automatic reflex simply isn't there.
The operating system is lagging.
Exactly.
And the text points out that even a perfectly sober, well-rested pilot can have a corrupted operating system if they fall into what Chapter 10 calls operational pitfalls or hazardous attitudes.
Oh, these are huge. These are behavioral traps. And ironically, highly experienced pilots actually fall into them more often than novices do.
Wait, really? The experienced one?
Yeah, because they get complacent. The FAA formally describes one of the most common pitfalls as the stubborn desire to complete a flight as planned, regardless of new hazards. In the aviation community, it's widely known as get-there-itis.
Get-there-itis. I love that term. So it's like you've driven an hour to the site, the client is waiting, you set up all your gear, and suddenly the wind picks up beyond the drone's safe operating limits. But because you've invested so much effort, you just push the throttle and launch anyway.
Yes, and that is a total failure of the process step in the 3P model. You perceived the wind, you saw it, but your desire to appease the client, which falls under the E for external pressures in that PAV checklist overrode your processing of the actual risk.
Right.
You allowed a hazardous attitude like impulsivity or just anti-authority to dictate the performance.
Okay, so the PAVE is the pilot, making sure our internal computer is running smoothly.
Yeah.
But we don't fly in a vacuum. We fly in the physical world, which brings us to the
environment.
To make a good decision, you have to know exactly where you are standing because the sky is carved into these invisible, highly regulated zones. If you blunder into the wrong one, your operating system is instantly overwhelmed.
This takes us right into Chapter 2, Airspace Classification, Operating Requirements, and Flight Restrictions.
Yeah.
For a remote pilot standing in an open field, just looking up at a blue sky, it is incredibly difficult to conceptualize that you are staring at a meticulously organized, three-dimensional highway system.
It really is. I'm looking at Figure 2.1 from the study guide right now, the airspace profile. It literally looks like a cross-section of a bizarre, invisible city made of cylinders and floating shelves.
It does.
Let's translate this two-dimensional drawing into something a pilot can actually visualize in the real world.
Okay, so the first major distinction you need to make is between controlled and uncontrolled airspace. Controlled airspace simply means air traffic control, or ATC, provides services and regulates the flow of traffic within that specific volume of air. For remote pilots, we are primarily concerned with Class B, C, D, and E airspace.
Let's start with the most restrictive one, Class B. I always think B for big or busy.
That's a good way to remember it. Class B surrounds the nation's busiest commercial airports. Places like LAX, JFK, Chicago O'Hare.
Big ones.
Exactly. The classic visual analogy the FAA uses is an upside-down wedding cake. The airspace starts at the surface right around the airport, and as you move further away, the bottom of the airspace steps up, creating these shelves, usually topping out around 10,000 feet mean sea level, or MSL.
Okay, but why shape it like a wedding cake? Why not just draw a giant solid cylinder around the whole airport?
It's all about efficiency and protecting the descent paths of massive commercial jets. A Boeing 777 needs a long, shallow glide path to land safely. The shelves of that wedding cake capture that descent path miles away from the airport. So by stepping the airspace up as you get further out, it allows smaller general aviation aircraft, like a Cessna, to fly safely underneath those shelves without having to talk to the heavy air traffic controllers managing the big jets above them.
That makes a lot of sense. But if I'm a Part 107 drone pilot and I want to fly in that bottom tier of the cake right at the surface near the airport runways.
You must receive authorization from ATC before operating. There are no exceptions.
None at all.
Right. The risk of a drone colliding with a commercial airliner on final approach is simply too high. You use systems like LANC, the low altitude authorization and notification capability, to request that access digitally.
Okay, so moving down the hierarchy. Class C. I think it's C for city airports.
That's a really helpful mnemonic. Class C airports are still very busy. They have an operational control tower and radar approach control, but they aren't the massive international hubs. They also have a very specific, standardized shape compared to the customized wedding cakes of Class B.
Yeah, Figure 2.1 shows it as two cylinders stacked on top of each other.
Right, a smaller cylinder on the bottom and a wider one on top. It consists of a surface area, typically with a 5 nautical mile radius around the airport.
Okay.
Then an outer circle with a 10 nautical mile radius that extends from 1,200 feet up to 4,000 feet above the airport elevation. And again, as a remote pilot, if you are within that surface area, you need ATC authorization.
Got it. Next is Class DD for dialogue, because manned pilots have to establish two-way dialogue with the control tower to enter.
Class D is for smaller regional airports that still have an operational control tower. The airspace is usually a single cylinder going from the surface up to 2,500 feet above the airport elevation.
Right.
It's tailored to contain any published instrument procedures. And yes, you still need authorization to fly a drone here.
Okay, let's slow down on this next one, because Class E airspace is the one that causes the most confusion for remote pilots. It is literally everywhere.
Literally everywhere. If airspace is controlled, but it isn't Class A, B, C, or D, it is Class E.
Right.
A massive percentage of the airspace over the United States is Class E. The purpose of Class E is to provide safe space for the control and separation of manned aircraft operating under instrument flight rules, or IFR.
Meaning planes that are flying through the clouds, navigating entirely by their instruments, not by looking out the window.
Precisely. Now, the confusing part for remote pilots is that Class E doesn't always start at the ground. You actually have to look at the VFR sectional charts in your testing supplement to know where the floor of the Class E airspace begins in your specific area.
Okay.
In most remote areas, the Class E base sits at 1,200 feet above ground level, or AGL.
Which is well above our heads. I mean, Part 107 pilots are generally restricted to a maximum altitude of 400 feet AGL.
Exactly. So if the Class E starts at 1,200 feet, you are flying completely underneath it.
Yeah.
But near airports without control towers, the Class E floor drops down to 700 feet AGL, and that's marked by a thick, shaded magenta line on the chart.
But why 700 feet? That just seems like a completely arbitrary number.
It exists to protect planes that are flying through the clouds on an instrument approach. As they descend toward the runway, they pop out of the clouds.
Oh, I see.
The FAA wants them to have a buffer of controlled airspace protecting them until they get visual sight of the ground. That 700-foot shelf provides that protection. But again, as a drone pilot at 400 feet, you are still underneath it, so you don't need authorization.
But there are places where Class E goes all the way down to the surface, right?
Yes, and that's marked by a dash magenta line on the chart, usually around airports without an operating control tower, but that still have instrument approaches. If the Class E goes to the surface and you want to fly your drone there, you absolutely need ATC authorization.
Which finally leaves us with Class G, uncontrolled airspace.
G for ground. It's the airspace that has not been designated as anything else. It extends from the surface up to the base of the overlying Class E airspace. Air traffic control has no authority or responsibility to control air traffic here. So if you are flying in Class G, you do not need authorization.
Okay, I have to step in here. Practically speaking, if I am standing in a field, how on earth do I translate these complex, invisible 3D shapes into my environment? There are no floating magenta lines in the sky. If I'm using the PAVE checklist to perceive my environment, how do I actually do it?
You do it during your pre-flight planning. The VFR sectional charts, which you will find multiple excerpts of in the Airman Knowledge Testing Supplement, those are your primary tool.
I'll read the maps.
You have to learn to read the 2D map and extrude those shapes in your mind. A solid blue line means Class B, a solid magenta line is Class C, a dashed blue line is Class D. You have to pinpoint your exact launch location on that chart and see what lines surround you.
And the charts show a lot more than just airport airspace. Chapter 2 dives into special use airspace. These are areas where you definitely do not want to accidentally launch a drone.
Oh, absolutely not. These are spaces where activities must be confined because of their nature, or where limitations are imposed on non-participating aircraft for national security. Let's start with the most serious one. Prohibited areas.
The book uses P-40 around Camp David in Figure 2.2 as an example.
You're right. The flight of all aircraft is absolutely prohibited in these areas for national security or other reasons associated with the national welfare. You will see these over the National Mall in Washington, D.C., or over active nuclear facilities.
And then there are restricted areas, which sound slightly less intense, but are arguably more dangerous to the physical drone.
Charted with an R, like R4401 in Figure 2.3. These areas contain unusual, often invisible hazards. We are talking about live artillery firing, aerial gunnery practice, or even the testing of guided missiles.
Wow.
Yeah, penetrating a restricted area without explicit authorization from the controlling agency is incredibly dangerous. You simply cannot see an artillery shell coming.
Taking a mortar round to your DJI Mavic is a guaranteed way to ruin your day. What about warning areas?
Warning areas are essentially restricted areas that happen to be located over domestic or international waters. They extend 3 nautical miles outward from the coast of the U.S.
Okay.
They are denoted with a W, like W237 in the text. They warn non-participating pilots of potential danger, usually naval exercises.
Then we have MOAs, military operation areas. Figure 2-5 shows the Camden Ridge MOA as an example.
MOAs are established to separate certain military training activities from IFR traffic. They aren't numbered, they have specific names. When an MOA is active, military aircraft could be performing acrobatics, abrupt maneuvers, or flying at high speeds.
Which brings up MTRs, military training routes, shown in Figure 2.7. The book says these are routes where military aircraft fly tactical low-level missions, often below 10,000 feet at speeds exceeding 250 knots.
Yeah, a fighter jet could come screaming through a valley or over a ridge at 300 miles per hour, literally hundreds of feet off the ground. By the time you hear the jet engines, the plane has already flown past you.
That's terrifying.
Checking your route for MTRs on your sectional chart is your only real defense against a mid-air collision in those zones.
So far, everything we've talked about, the airspace, the restricted zones, is static. It's printed on the map. But the sky is a living, breathing environment. And Chapter 11 introduces elements of the environment that change from day to day, specifically NOTAMs, notices to airmen.
Right. A printed sectional chart is only updated every 56 days. And a lot can happen in 2 months. NOTAMs are time-critical aeronautical information that is either temporary in nature or just wasn't known far enough in advance to print on the physical charts.
We were talking about hazards like an air show taking place over the weekend, or the flashing red light on top of a 500-foot radio tower burning out, making it an invisible hazard at night.
Or even a massive migration of birds passing through an area, which they actually call a bird tam.
A bird tam, that's wild. But the most critical NOTAM for drone pilots, though, is the TFR, Temporary Flight Restriction.
Since the events of September 11th, 2001, the FAA's use of TFRs has become highly common. They are issued via a Flight Data Center, or FDC NOTAM.
Right.
The FAA will drop a temporary cylinder of restricted airspace to protect the president while they travel, or to clear the airspace over a massive wildfire so water bomber planes can operate, or even just to prevent a swarm of aircraft from hovering over the Super Bowl.
The book explicitly notes that there have been incidents of pilots busting through TFRs and facing immediate security investigations, certificate suspensions, and massive fines.
And you cannot perceive a TFR just by looking at the sky. A VIP movement looks exactly the same as an empty blue sky.
Right, there's no visual cue.
Checking for active NOTAMs on the FAA website or through an approved flight planning app is a mandatory, non-negotiable step in your ADM risk mitigation before every single flight.
Okay, so we've established the invisible boundaries. We know how to check the NOTAMs. We have verified we are in a safe, legal box of airspace. But now we have to contend with the physical substance inside that box, the air itself, the weather.
This is a huge one. Chapters 3A and 3B, this is where meteorology dictates the physical reality of what your aircraft can and cannot do.
Chapter 3A walks us through aviation weather reports, specifically the METAR, which stands for Aviation Routine Weather Report. And I have to be honest with you. The first time I looked at a raw METAR, I felt like I was looking at the cascading green code in the movie The Matrix. It just looks like a garbled, random string of numbers and letters.
Oh, it is deeply intimidating at first glance, I agree. Because it's a shorthand code designed to pack a massive amount of data into a tiny text string back from the days of teletype machines. But just like in The Matrix, once you understand the syntax, you stop seeing the code. You just see a thunderstorm forming over the runway.
Let's do it then. Let's decode The Matrix right now. The study guide provides this exact example, and I'm going to read it exactly as it's printed. You ready?
Ready.
Okay, it says KGGG 1617530Z OR21 2 at 20 ski 34 SM plus TSRA BR BKN 008 OVC 0C4CB 827D A219 SETI RMK pre-SFR.
That is a mouthful.
Okay, I'm going to try and parse this out and you correct my logic. The first block is KGGG. The K is the prefix for airports in the contiguous 48 states, right? So GGG is the airport code.
Spot on. It's Gregg County Airport in Texas. The first block is always the station identifier telling you where the observation was taken.
Awesome. Next block, 161753Z. This looks like a timestamp. Is the 16 the date?
Yes, the 16th day of the current month.
And 1753Z is the time, 17.53 Zulu time.
Which is Coordinated Universal Time, or Greenwich Mean Time. Aviation operates on one global clock, so there is no confusion across time zones. Next is the modifier, AU20.
Meaning a machine generated this, not a guy standing on the tarmac with an anemometer.
Correct. It came from an automated surface observing station. Now we get to the critical data for a pilot, the wind. 14 G26 KT.
Okay, I see KT at the end, so I assume that means knots, measuring speed. So it's 140-something, 21 gusting to 26.
You've got it. The first three digits, 140, indicate the true direction the wind is blowing from. So 140 degrees on a compass, which is blowing from the southeast. The 21 is the sustained wind speed in knots. The G26 means it is gusting up to 26 knots.
A sustained wind of 21 knots, gusting to 26. For a small drone that weighs 2 pounds, that wind is incredibly hazardous. You're going to burn through your battery just trying to hold a hover. Okay, next block, 34 SM. SM is statute miles. So 3/4 of a mile visibility.
Prevailing visibility, and it's not great. The legal minimum for Part 107 is 3 statute miles of visibility, so right away, this METAR is telling you that you are legally grounded.
And the next block explains why visibility is so bad. This is the weather phenomena string, plus TSRA, BR, This is where it really looks like gibberish.
You have to reference Figure 3.1 in the testing supplement, the descriptors and weather phenomena chart, to learn these abbreviations. The plus sign denotes heavy intensity. TS stands for thunderstorm, RA stands for rain. So heavy thunderstorms and rain.
And BR. I always want to say baby rain.
It's actually from the French word brume, meaning mist. Mist is essentially a very light fog.
Heavy thunderstorms, rain, and mist. Not a great day for flying. Next is the sky condition. BKN 008 OVC 012CB.
So referencing Figure 3.2 for contractions, BKN means broken clouds. The numbers following it represent the height of the cloud base in hundreds of feet.
Right.
So 008 means broken clouds at 800 feet above ground level.
Then OVC is overcast, solid cloud cover at 012, which means 1,200 feet, and CB.
Cumulonimbus clouds. Those are massive, towering storm clouds, the most dangerous clouds in aviation.
Next is a fraction, 1817, temperature and dew point.
Yes, both measured in Celsius. The temperature is 18 degrees. The dew point is 17 degrees.
I want to pause here and look at the mechanics of this because I think a lot of people memorize the definition of dew point without actually understanding what it physically means.
It is so vital to understand. Air acts like a sponge. It can hold water vapor, but hot air can hold a lot more water than cold air. The dew point is the temperature at which the air becomes 100% saturated. It physically cannot hold any more water vapor.
So if the temperature is 18 degrees and it drops just 1 degree to 17, the sponge is completely full.
And when the sponge is full, the invisible water vapor has to go somewhere. It condenses out of the air into visible liquid droplets. That is what fog is. That is what mist is. That is what clouds are.
I see.
When you see a METAR where the temperature and dew point are within 3 degrees of each other, you must anticipate fog or low clouds forming rapidly.
Which completely explains the BR, the mist, and the terrible visibility we decoded earlier. Finally, the altimeter setting, A2970, and the remarks RMK pre-SFR.
The A is for altimeter, meaning the barometric pressure is 29.70 inches of mercury. The remarks pre-SFR translate to pressure falling rapidly.
Right.
A rapidly dropping barometric pressure is a classic sign of an approaching storm front.
So tying this all back to our aeronautical decision-making framework, seeing plus TSRA in a METAR isn't just a puzzle to solve. It is a critical hazard that you must process.
Exactly. Heavy thunderstorms bring violent wind shear, microbursts that can slam an aircraft into the ground, erratic gusts, and lightning. The pilot must process that this environment vastly exceeds the physical performance capabilities of a small, unmanned aircraft, which forces the perform decision in the 3P model. You keep the drone in the case.
And it's not just the current weather we care about, it's the forecast. Chapter 3A also covers TAFs, terminal aerodrome forecasts.
Right. While a METAR is a snapshot of what is happening right this second, a TAF is a meteorologist's prediction of what is expected to happen over a 24 or 30-hour period within a 5-mile radius of the airport.
And it uses the exact same coding language as the METAR, right? So once you learn the matrix code, you can read both.
Yep. The testing supplement has multiple real-world examples. If you look at Figure 15, you see multiple TAFs showing how conditions are expected to change throughout the day, using time groups like FM from a specific time or tempo to indicate temporary fluctuations in the weather.
And then Chapter 3B introduces another critical weather concept that bridges the gap between meteorology and the actual physical aerodynamics of your drone. Density altitude.
Oh, this is a big one.
Density altitude. It is the invisible nemesis of aircraft performance. The text states that density altitude is determined by pressure, temperature, and humidity. Let's break down the mechanics of why that actually matters.
To a pilot, density altitude simply means how thick or thin the air feels to the aircraft. High elevations, higher temperatures, and high humidity all contribute to a high density altitude. And high density altitude means the air is physically less dense. The air molecules are spread further apart.
Let's visualize a drone's propeller for a second. A propeller is not a fan. It is a rotating wing. It generates lift by literally grabbing onto air molecules and throwing them downward. If the air is thin, there are simply fewer air molecules for that wing to bite into.
It's the difference between trying to paddle a canoe through water versus trying to paddle a canoe through a tub of whipped cream. Your paddle just slips right through the whipped cream without generating any forward thrust.
That is a fantastic analogy. So the air in Denver on a hot July afternoon acts like whipped cream to your drone's props.
The physical impact on your aircraft is drastic. Your rate of climb decreases, your maximum altitude drops, and because the propellers are slipping through the thin air, the motors have to spin much faster, drawing significantly more amperage from your battery just to maintain a hover.
Oh.
So your expected 25-minute flight time might suddenly become 15 minutes.
Which perfectly transitions us from the environment to the machine itself.
Yeah.
Because the weather changes the physical properties of the air, and that air dictates how the drone's actual weight and aerodynamics will perform. This brings us to chapters 4 and 8, loading and performance.
This is where we introduce the concepts of weight, balance, stability, and load factors. This is where the physics of aviation get very real.
Let's address weight first. The study guide says excessive weight reduces flight performance in almost every respect. You have a higher takeoff speed, a reduced rate of climb, a shorter range, and reduced maneuverability. But the fascinating part to me is that it's not just about how heavy the drone is when it is sitting on your desk.
Right.
It's about how heavy the drone feels when it is maneuvering through the air.
That is the concept of load factor. A load factor is the ratio of the total load supported by the aircraft's lift, divided by the total weight of the aircraft. It is measured in Gs, or the acceleration of gravity.
So when your drone is hovering perfectly level on a calm day, your load factor is 1G. The structure of the drone is supporting its own resting weight.
But the moment you initiate a maneuver, say you bank the drone hard to the side to make a steep, coordinated turn, you introduce a new vector of energy, centrifugal force.
The same force that pushes you against the door of your car when you take a highway off-ramp too fast.
Precisely. The study guide uses figure 4.1 and 4.2 to illustrate how these forces interact. During a banked turn at a constant altitude, the load factor is the resultant vector of two different forces: gravity pulling straight down toward the Earth and centrifugal force pulling horizontally outward from the center of the turn.
Because these two forces are combining, it artificially increases the weight the aircraft feels. And the math provided in the text is just wild. If you bank the aircraft at a 60-degree angle, the load factor mathematically becomes 2 Gs. You have literally doubled the effective weight of the aircraft.
And it scales exponentially. Look at figure 4.2. If you bank to 80 degrees, the load factor shoots up to 5.76 Gs.
That's crazy.
If your drone weighs 5 pounds in an 80-degree turn, the wings or propellers must suddenly produce enough lift to support nearly 29 pounds just to keep the drone from losing altitude.
Okay, practically speaking though, if I am flying a quadcopter to inspect a solar panel array on a roof, I am not doing aerobatic maneuvers. I am not banking at 80 degrees. So why does the FAA mandate that I learn about G-forces and accelerated stall speeds?
Because emergencies happen, and understanding load limits is the ultimate form of risk management within your ADM framework. Let's create a realistic scenario.
Let's do it.
Let's say you are flying a large hexacopter, and you've loaded it right up to its maximum gross weight limit because you attached a heavy cinema camera and a dual battery setup.
Okay, the aircraft is at max weight.
And you are filming a mountain bike race in Utah on a hot 95-degree summer afternoon.
High elevation plus high heat equals high density altitude. The air is incredibly thin. The propellers are already struggling to bite into that whipped cream air.
Exactly. You are flying along trapping a biker, and suddenly a news helicopter drops over the ridgeline directly into your flight path. To avoid a catastrophic mid-air collision, you jam the control stick hard to the right, throwing your drone into an abrupt, evasive 60-degree banking turn.
Based on the math, you just double the load factor to 2 Gs. Your heavy drone now feels twice as heavy to the thin air.
Yes, and here is the critical aerodynamic danger outlined in Figure 4.3 and testing supplement Figure 72, which charts velocity versus G-loads. Stalling speed increases in proportion to the square root of the load factor.
I want to make sure the mechanics of a stall are crystal clear here, because a lot of non-pilots think a stall means the engine stops working, like stalling a manual transmission car.
Oh, that's a very common misconception. In aviation, a stall has nothing to do with the motor. A stall is an aerodynamic event. It happens when the smooth flow of air traveling over the airfoil, or in the case of a drone, the propeller blades separates and becomes turbulent. When that airflow detaches, the propeller instantly stops generating lift.
And the text says that the speed at which that stall happens increases when you add G-force. Let's do the math on the square root formula. If a fixed-wing drone normally stalls at 50 knots, and you throw it into a massive turn that induces a load factor of 4G, the square root of 4 is 2. So you multiply the original stall speed by 2. The aircraft now stalls at 100 knots.
Exactly. So back to our heavy drone in Utah. You bank hard to avoid the helicopter, you double the G-load, and the aerodynamic stall speed of your propellers spikes dramatically. Because the air is thin from the density altitude and the drone is already overweight, your motors physically cannot produce the massive amount of excess thrust required to overcome the induced drag of that 2G turn.
The propellers just can't spin fast enough to keep the airflow attached.
The air separates from the blades, lift is completely destroyed, the drone stalls, tumbles, and falls out of the sky onto the racetrack below.
Yikes.
Understanding load limits isn't about learning to fly like a fighter pilot. It's about understanding the absolute outer boundaries of your aircraft's physical envelope, so you never accidentally push your drone over the edge during an emergency.
And if you look at Figure 34 in the testing supplement, the weight and balance graphs, you can see how aircraft's center of gravity exacerbates all of this. If the CG is too far aft, outside the approved limits, the drone becomes inherently unstable, making it much easier to enter a stall and nearly impossible to recover from one.
Which is why the aircraft check in the PAVE checklist is so vital. You must perceive the limitations of your specific hardware in the context of that specific environment.
But let's follow the timeline of that scenario. Despite your best ADM, despite checking the METARs and calculating your weight, you had to make an evasive maneuver, and the drone did stall. It is now falling toward the ground. You have suddenly transitioned from normal, deliberate operations into a full-blown crisis.
Right.
Which brings us to the final segment of our deep dive, Emergencies in Communication, covering chapters 5, 7, and 12.
Once the drone is falling, you are entirely reliant on your reflexes and the contingency plans you built on the ground. But communication plays a massive role in mitigating these disasters before they result in a collision.
Let's talk about Chapter 7 first, radio communication. Now, to be absolutely clear on the regulations, as a Part 107 remote pilot, you are not legally required to carry a handheld aviation radio. You are not required to talk to air traffic control or manned aircraft when you are operating in uncontrolled Class G airspace.
That is correct. However, the FAA heavily encourages remote pilots to understand aviation language and to carry a scanner so they can monitor the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, or CTAF, especially when operating anywhere near a non-towered airport.
I think the best way to visualize a CTAF is to think of it like eavesdropping on a massive invisible party line.
That's a good way to put it.
You don't have to speak into the radio. In fact, you really shouldn't clutter the frequency by transmitting unless you have a true emergency. But if you want to know if a Cessna is about to line up for a runway near your operation area, you need to know who is in the room and what they're doing.
And to understand what they are doing, you have to be fluent in the phonetic alphabet. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo. Manned aircraft pilots use this alphabet along with their aircraft's specific call sign to broadcast their position and their intentions to everyone else on the frequency.
If you are listening to your radio and you hear a pilot broadcast, Cessna, November 123, Alpha Bravo on downwind for runway 19er, you need to be able to instantly process that information. You need to know what a downwind leg of a traffic pattern is, and you need to process where that plane is relative to your drone's altitude.
And if that emergency does happen, if your drone has a flyaway due to GPS failure and is now heading directly toward the flight path of that Cessna, you need to know how to grab your radio and communicate that hazard clearly and concisely using standard aviation phraseology.
But the primary goal of emergency management is to prevent the emergency from happening in the first place. Which brings us to Chapter 12 and Chapter 5, which outline pre-flight procedures and emergency protocols.
The regulations dictate that the remote pilot in command is ultimately legally responsible for ensuring the aircraft is in a safe condition before every single flight.
Chapter 12 points to Advisory Circular 107-2 for maintenance and pre-flight procedures. You cannot just pull a drone out of the trunk of your car, unfold the arms, and chuck it into the air without looking at it.
If we tie this back to the core theme of aeronautical decision-making, specifically the TEAM framework. TEAM is a choice list for managing risk, standing for transfer, eliminate, accept, or mitigate. A thorough, hands-on pre-flight inspection eliminates mechanical risks before they can manifest in the air.
You run your finger along the edge of the propeller. You feel a hairline crack in the plastic. You replace the prop before you launch. You have just successfully eliminated the risk of an in-flight structural failure that would have caused the drone to fall out of the sky.
And carrying that aviation radio to listen to the CTAF? That mitigates the risk of a mid-air collision. You can't eliminate manned aircraft from the sky, you can't transfer the risk to someone else, but by actively building your situational awareness, you significantly reduce the probability of an incident.
The text makes a pretty sobering point about in-flight emergencies. When a motor catches fire or a flock of birds attacks the drone, you do not have time to sit down, pull out the study guide, and run through the deliberate perceive, process, perform framework.
No, in a true sudden emergency, you are entirely reliant on the time-critical, naturalized decision-making we discussed back in Chapter 10. You fall back on your muscle memory, your training, and your standard operating procedures. The time to think about what to do during an engine failure or a lost link scenario is on the ground during the planning phase, long before the flight ever begins.
Which really brings this entire syllabus full circle. Every single complex topic we've broken down today, from visualizing the invisible, multi-layered cylinders of Class B airspace, to decoding the syntax of a METAR report, to understanding the aerodynamics of a 60-degree banked turn, to memorizing the phonetic alphabet. None of these are just abstract hurdles designed by the FAA to make the test harder.
Exactly. They are all individual sensory inputs. They are the essential data points you use to run your operating system. They allow you to accurately perceive hazards in your environment, process the physical risk to your aircraft, and perform safe professional operations.
We have covered a massive amount of ground through the FAA remote pilot syllabus today. We've mapped out the static architecture of the sky. We've decoded the dynamic weather systems moving through it. We've calculated the physics of flight. And hopefully, we've helped you upgrade the operating system of your own aeronautical decision-making.
But before we wrap up the discussion, looking at the entire scope of ADM raises a fascinating philosophical question about the future of aviation, something for you to ponder as you continue studying the material.
I'm always up for a thought experiment. Let's hear it.
We opened this deep dive by talking about the 80% human error statistic, the entire concept of ADM, the PAVE checklist, the 3P model. It is all designed to fix the flawed human operating system. But as drone technology accelerates, we're seeing the software take over. We now have onboard AI that offers automatic obstacle avoidance, automated return-to-home functions if the battery gets low, and flight controllers that physically refuse to let the drone enter a steep bank that would cause a stall.
So the machine is literally stepping in and doing the perceiving and processing for you.
Exactly. So the question we have to ask ourselves as an industry is, as the machine does more of the heavy lifting for us, does our personal ADM muscle begin to atrophy? If the software constantly prevents you from flying into a building or refuses to let the motors start because it detects bad weather, are we still truly acting as pilots, or are we slowly degrading into mere managers of a flying computer?
That is a chilling thought, because the technology isn't infallible. If the optical sensors get covered in dust or the GPS module fails, the automation instantly shuts off. And if your ADM muscle has atrophied because you relied on the computer for 3 years, you are suddenly handed full manual control of a falling aircraft, completely vulnerable to the physics and the elements.
Which is why the ultimate challenge to every remote pilot is to never let the technology override your own human judgment. The drone's telemetry might tell you have 10 minutes of battery left, the software might tell you the airspace is clear, but the final authoritative decision to operate safely always rests with the pilot in command.
The ultimate responsibility is human. Keep studying the invisible highways, keep decoding the matrix of the weather, and never stop questioning the performance of your own operating system. Keep your ADM sharp.